Welcome back. You're watching Bottomline Africa. And in this second part of the bulletin, we want to have a conversation with our regular pundits here on KTN News. Joining me for this discussion is Joy Brenda Mdivo, who's a lawyer and a political analyst. Mark Bichachi is a political analyst, and Javas Bigambo is a governance expert. Many thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me this evening. And we want to just unpack that statement that was made by the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, today. And I want to start with you, Joy. From that statement, is this a call for a revolution from where you stand?
I think the political parties now are coming to the realization that with the election being over, there's need for progress, especially for the opposition. There's need to consolidate and have progress. And so today's statement was basically not aimed at the general public, but basically it was aimed at the NASA supporters. And with what I heard today, I think the Honorable Prime Minister is trying to tell his troops, look, we still have options. This is not over. If we employ different tactics, we might still be able to get to where we need to go, which is for free, fair, credible, verifiable elections. And so what I heard today, maybe not a revolution in the sense that we want to think about it, but for him, I think it was a call to sort of gather his troops back together again. Mm-hmm. However, how it's being perceived by his people, you could see with the reaction today, with the media people being harassed. Some of them are taking it up as a call, not exactly to arms, but to agitation. Mm-hmm. So they're not looking at it as peaceful protests. They're looking at it like they need to do something. They must do something. And that's why you see blood is running hot, and there are all these reactions. Mm. So that's what I heard today, and that's what I think the main idea was to tell his troops, look, let's not disassemble. Yesterday has come and gone. Let's plan moving forward. We still have options, and we still have a plan.
All right, and Mark, Joy talks of different people reading that statement differently. There is one particular phrase in that statement that there shall be, if there's no justice for the people, there will not be peace for the government. What would you read this to mean? Because it's what really many are reading as a provocation of agitation. What would you read this to be?
One would hope that it is not a provocation into any form of violent protest or any form of violent resistance. But this being Kenya, we cannot look at it outside of its own history. And the history of demonstrations in this country is such that every time we've had an grievance against the government, it's always been our reaction to take some form of uncultured and maybe even violent steps against the government. That being said, we also need to understand that Raila Odinga is in a very difficult position. In fact, I do not wish to be in his position. And the reason why I say that is that he is at the end of the proverbial rope. But him being the politician of his class and the enigma of Kenyan politics that he has to pull a rabbit out of the hat. And unfortunately, the rabbit that is out of the hat is a resistance against the government of the day. And that resistance, by the way, is not only going to be resisted by the government, but there's also the factor of time. How much longer can he keep his people and his supporters on edge and agitating for change, even though they feel the economic pinch, even though they feel the desire to move on? So the question is the desire to move on versus the agitation as requested by the leader, which will win out? And that's really the big question.
Right. And Javas, they speak about creating a people's assembly, which will have all these various groups of people participating, from women and youth to religious leaders to political, the political class as well. But perhaps just to create an understanding, what kind of form are we looking at, and which people are this? Because both sides of the political divide speak of controlling and leading a large population of, or a large following, if you like. So just what kind of a picture are we looking at for this people's assembly?
Well, first, Sharon, we have to come to a realization that here in Kenya, politics is our new religion. We eat politics, drink politics. In fact, it makes our DNA. And that is why the election seems to be over, but politics seems to be gaining traction, turning different directions. After listening to the Honorable Raila Odinga and his call now for a people's assembly, it brings in the feeling, the thought, that there is a way the former Prime Minister wants to start stirring up or reinvigorating his support bases to keep them politically active and keep pushing on with various demands that they feel will give them certain political benefits or dividends that maybe they did not gain through the electoral process that just came to a close by the declaration of the results by ABC yesterday. Now, when you listen to and analyze the entire speech by Honorable Raila Odinga, you will not just look at those remarks without reflecting on various issues across the continent. You will find yourself thinking about the situations in South Africa during the apartheid movement. You will find yourself thinking about Uganda during the time of Obote and Amin Dada, and then Museveni. You will find yourself thinking about South Sudan and the challenges that they have continued to go through. You will find yourself thinking about the situation in Nigeria, especially from around July 1967 to 15th January 1970, during the challenges of the Biafran War, and the kind of challenges that the people of Nigeria, especially the Igbo, faced.
Right.
When you look at it that way, you realize that here in Africa, the challenge of stabilizing our democratic process remains to be a major challenge. And coming back, for example, and putting into focus Honorable Raila Odinga's statement, you realize that actually, for him, a new game has just started. And to look at Raila Odinga's statement in a very simplistic way would be a little too dangerous to any political mind. And that is why it may be very important for all sides, whether it's the side of Jubilee or the side of NASA, to appreciate that it's going to come with very huge ramifications.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Javas. And Joy, let's look at the larger scheme of things here. And the National Council of Churches of Kenya today proposed an expansion of the executive to include a prime minister position, a deputy prime minister position. Do you feel that this is the kind of solution we need that would also promote inclusivity and healing and, you know, that unifying feeling in the country?
Let's look back at 2007, 2008.
Right.
That's one of the solutions that we employed. We gave ourselves a president and a prime minister, and then we gave ourselves two separate sets of ministers doing the exact same job, but being given different titles. And we had a cabinet of 42 people. And one of the things that the Kenyan people are in agreement with is we did not need larger government, we needed a leaner government. However, I'm one of the people who thinks we need to be more creative with our executive, because as it is, if you've got only one president and one deputy, and we have 42 tribes, it would take 42 election cycles. No, wait, now I think we're 43, 44. It would take 44 election cycles for each tribe, if we go equity, to be able to produce a president. By that time, I mean, people forget what their presidency, quote unquote, was like. So we need to be more creative with how we do this.
Right.
And that's why I do not agree with NCCK. I think one way of going about it, for example, is rather than even changing the structure of government, is let's stagger the elections so that you have a presidential election running by itself early, and then you have election of governors and senators running after that, so that if you lose out on the presidential election, you have a chance to run as a senator or governor, so that you're still able to participate in governance and in politics without necessarily being in status and remain relevant. You see, Senator McCain ran for presidency in America, and then when he failed, he went and ran for Senate. Same thing with Hillary Clinton. Now, when we do that, two things happen. One, you're able to afford the politicians a lifeline, which is something that we don't have in our current structure. It's winner takes all, which doesn't make sense, because look at our current scenario. Honorable Raila has got millions of people who are following him, but because he did not ascend to the presidency this time round, they are all feeling disenfranchised, which is just not right. So there's one, gives people a second chance. But the other thing it also does If, for example, you have something like the situation we have now, where people feel that the presidency is not doing or is not being what they imagined it would be, then you have a chance at the primaries to sort of, quote-unquote, punish the president by giving him a smaller margin to work with in terms of the National Assembly and with the Council of Governors and in the Senate.
Right. And Mark, do you agree with Joy? Because we cannot wish away the spirit of that proposal by the clergymen, which is that there's a section of Kenyans who have perennially felt not part of the helm of governance in this country. There's that question of inclusivity. Would that system of governance in this country really use a blueprint as such other Western countries, or do we need a unique solution?
You know, one of the things that Kenya must quickly realize is we do play tribal politics every election cycle. And as such, we need to wake up to the reality that not only is it a winner-take-all and a loser-lose-all situation, it is also a situation where an entire community of people feels disenfranchised. And that's why I've argued before that this particular debacle that we've had is not about the IEBC, it's not about the elections, it's about the feeling of every community that participated, including the communities that felt like they won, that they're not included in central government. And waking up to that reality tells you that what you need to do pretty quickly is you need to find a way of creating an all-inclusive electoral process. And this is what I mean. The funny thing about our electoral process right now as it stands is there's a governor who is governor by 100,000 votes, okay? And he has executive power and has a say in how this country is run. And yet, you've got a presidential candidate who can get 7, 8 million votes and not be able to have a say in how the country is run. And let's not forget that those millions of votes do want to say something. They do have a voice and they do have an opinion in terms of how things should be done. And if you look at the UK, you look at Germany, you look at all these different places, running for high office does not necessarily mean that if you fail, you fall into the cracks of political oblivion. So I do agree with Joy, and I do also agree with the NCCK. But more importantly, I don't think we need a solution now. I think what we need is a real introspection by the Kenyan people. And we need to sit down and have conversations round about how we want this to be done. One of the things that Joy has said that is very critical is we've got 44 tribes. You know, 44 election cycles is 200 years later. Some people cannot wait that long, and we need to recognize that there are some tribes whose population is dwindling. Therefore, the solution cannot just be the creation of positions, but also how do we make these positions get filled? And just to give you an example, in Tanzania, for example, they shift from a Muslim president to a Christian president every cycle, and then they also try and make sure that the prime minister, the deputy, come from the minority tribes. This is how Kenya has to do it. We have to find a homegrown solution for a homegrown problem.
Right, Java, speaking of homegrown solutions for homegrown problems, what perhaps would you say are the options we would be looking at, should it be politically or otherwise, if it means reforming the constitution, that would see a solution to the immediate crisis of really division that we are seeing across the country, and also for the long term?
Well, first, Sharon, I think having listened to religious leaders speak throughout this campaign period, I am deeply convinced that we need more teachers than preachers in this country. And while I do not want to dismiss outrightly their proposal, I think it is important for us to come to an agreement that government structure is not the problem. And that going by their proposal, for instance, if we're to create position of prime minister and 2 deputies, it will not cure the problems or the challenges that this country is facing. It will not be the solution to the issues that NASA has been or continues to call for, whether it's a question of proper electoral governance processes, whether it's a question of increased amounts of money allocated to county governments, whether it's a question of creation of employment opportunities, whether it's a question of gender parity. It will not be cured by those positions or the expansion of the executive. What we need is a government that works. And when you look at it this way, If we just create that position, then co-opt Raila Odinga into government and then co-opt Kalonzo Musyoka and Mudavadi into government, really, is that the highest aspiration that we would want as a people, purely just to appease various political interests and aspirations and salvage some political careers? I think that's not the whole point. What I think NCCK should come to a realization is this. This country's problems are big, and they predate even the Constitution of Kenya 2010. They go back to the periods of independence and even before that. So for us to sort out these challenges, we need to bring ourselves again to proper national conversations. Here in this country, what ails us the most is that we are never too honest with ourselves when it comes to having political conversations. And whenever we come closer to being honest, we become too brutal, too violent, and that is itself anathema to sense. In fact, it's antithetical to sense that is necessary for democratic progress. Now, moving forward, going by the proposal that NASA has made, and the creation of their
People's Assembly.
The county, the People's Assemblies, and then there is the question of the National Resistance Movement, which I think they're breathing life into it. And then you see how the Jubilee administration is also standing strong with its position and not willing and keen to reach out to the other side. I think, one, we need to ask ourselves whether we love this country so much and which part of the law we want to appreciate. Is it just the kind of law that we want to tap into it when it suits us or not? Because each side is actually reciting the Constitution and various constitutional provisions and claiming that they are serving the interests of the people and respecting the sovereignty of the people.
Right, and Javas, you actually bring up a question that was going to come up later because two of you actually are lawyers, because we're seeing a lot of legal division on legal opinion in terms of interpretation of the Constitution. Is this a weakness of this document that is governing us, or what is this? Because everybody is interpreting this document to their end. What are we looking at here?
Well, there is no problem with all these diverse interpretations of the Constitution, because we know very well, to those who've gone to law school, that any piece of legislation will be subjected to 3 rules of interpretation. And that is why, and when it comes to especially interpreting or understanding the Constitution, one even delves deeper, and you will never find a homogeneous understanding or interpretation of the Constitution. But I think what we need to ask ourselves is this. If at all, each side is speaking to matters of sovereignty, each side is speaking to matters of the superiority of the people and the greater good of this country, then why is it that they are finding it very difficult to create a melting pot of ideas where we say, hey, whether you are Luo, whether you are Kikuyu, whether you are Gusi, whichever part of the country you come from, that we need to realize this country's cake must first of all be baked by our own hard work before we sit down to start eating it up. And that's why it is important for the side of NASA to realize that if we take the approach, for example, of people's assemblies and then creating some kind of, or stirring up some kind of, I want to call it uprising, realizing what has happened on the parts of this continent before, whether it's the Arab Spring, etc., we'll realize that, and looking at also the thirst for people to come out and let out their emotions, for example, as it has happened through demonstrations,
right,
we realize that most of the time it will never be too peaceful and too constructive. Most of the time it's a bit destructive on property and other resources.
Right.
So it's important for us to, I think, have a discussion that even if we want to reach out to the people and stir them up and see how to push forward in terms of various reforms that this country needs, then it must be the kind of push that makes us better as a people, makes institutions better, and also makes Kenya better. But we need to realize further that the issues of structural changes, the reforms that NASA is speaking to, are very crucial. If you joke around with the democratic and electoral processes of any country, those countries have always gone down.
All right. And just talking about going forward, and in light of this all these things, the end that we want to reach at, which is fast getting to the end of this electoral cycle and things going on forward, including the economy of this country, which is really suffering under the weight of all this. And Joy, what do you think are the options that Jubilee would have following the statement that was made by NASA today?
Allow me to break a little bit from protocol and answer my own question rather than answer yours. The options is not for Jubilees. What's the question? The question is, what are the options for Kenyans? Mm-hmm. One of the things I think we need to understand is that within the Constitution, there's a provision for the next 7 days when any Kenyan can raise a petition in the Supreme Court regarding the legitimacy, legality, or otherwise of the just concluded election.
Right.
Once that is done, then there's the 14 days and what we had before. If there's nothing that has been filed within 7 days, then you go ahead and prepare now for a swearing in at the beginning of a second term. So that will sort of bring the election cycle to an end. Mm-hmm. But the thing that Javas pointed out is that with Kenya, we finish the elections and we start the politics. And I think that has been our Achilles heel, that we do politicking so much that we forget that politics affects the rest of our lives. And that's what we're finding out now with our economy, with our businesses suffering. And I think Kenyans have to get to a place where we realize, you know what, as Kenyans, we each have a role to play. The politicians have a job to do, and the rest of us have another job to do.
Right.
And one thing I hope Kenyans will be alive to is the fact that once the politicians are settled in their roles and they start playing their roles, then for the rest of us, we also need to settle into our roles. And that's why now when you see that, like today I was listening to some commentators, people who are calling in on one of the local radio shows, and there's someone who's saying, look, I rely so much on everybody's services. If I'm asked to go out and demonstrate, or if I'm asked to engage in the demos, then what happens to my pocket? Do I get subsidies, or how am I going to support? Kenyans need to ask themselves those questions so that we get to a place where the politics comes to an end. But the other point I also want to make is our politicians also need to get some maturity in how they do their politics, such that you understand your role, not just in ascending to office, but in building legacy. For example, if we think, I'm a believer in the Bible, if you think back to biblical times, right now you don't hear people called Herod or somebody called Pontius Pilate. And yet in those days, those were the most important people who are in office. Yeah. But you hear people called Joseph and Mary. Why? Because those are people who left a legacy that lasted to this day. We need to understand as politicians, as leaders, there's a lot more we can do, even when we don't ascend to office, that leaves footprints not just in the sand, but etched on the wall of Kenyan history. That's more important than just constant politicking. So I wish for many of them, they would want to be known in the halls of fame of Kenyans, rather than to just be known for this cycle and the next cycle. And, let's get out of that. Let's, we would talk about a higher calling. Let it be a higher calling where you're a leader, and not necessarily because you occupy office, but because you not only capture the imagination of Kenyans, but you also contribute to the progress of Kenyans. And I wish our leaders would build legacy rather than political careers, because political careers come and die.
Right. And Mark, what would you tell Kenyans? What would you say are some of the crucial thoughts that we should be having, that we should be simmering over as Kenyans, having all the options, all the way forward political options on the table as at today by that statement that was made by the opposition leader? What crucial thoughts do we need to be bearing as Kenyans at this point in time?
I think the question is first, are we Kenyan? That's the first question, because if we are Kenyan, then the considerations change away from political considerations, change away from the personal interests of people, and we begin to have a conversation and thoughts round about what kind of country do we want to live in? And that's the most important question. Do I want to live in a country where every 5 years I have to rush to the supermarket and I can't find bread because all my neighbors bought all of it because they're panicking in their buying? Do you want to live in a nation where every 5 years I have to revise my friends on Facebook because I don't know who's my friend anymore based on affiliation? Do I want to live in a country where children in class 5 almost beat each other halfway to death simply because they're in two different political parties in class 5? How is that even possible? Now, the reality of the matter is there are a number of things that we as a nation have to address. Number one, the politicking. The problem with our politics in Kenya, and this is coming from the bottom of my heart. If you look at the past election, what exactly were we voting for? There was no manifesto, there was no promise, there was no nothing. It was simply a situation which we walked into, and we voted because we had to vote. And we voted because we didn't like the other guy, and we voted because we like this other person. But there was no concrete reason behind our voting.
Right.
That said, we need to take a step back. What is that step back? Number one, remove the high stakes from our politics. That's the problem. We feel like life and death hangs on our politics. You would think that the Kenyan election affects the throne in heaven and somehow Lucifer will take over. That is the problem. We think that whoever we vote for is going to be God's deputy. It does not work like that. So we need to reduce the stakes. We need to get into a position where the elections are not things that are life and death. Then we can begin to interrogate what kind of roads do we want, what kind of bridges do we want, and most importantly, what relationships do we want across our tribes.
Fantastic. Mark Bichachi, that is a very good point at which to end our conversation tonight. Thank you all for joining me this evening. Our regular pundits here on KTN News. Joy Brenda Mdivo is a lawyer and political analyst, Mark Bichachi, political analyst, and Javas Bigambo, governance expert. Many thanks, lady and gentlemen, always a pleasure to have you. Right, let's move on now to our images of the day. And Addis Ababa hosted Ethiopia's first international dance festival to show the country's unique dance culture and present the work of renowned international companies.